In April 1938, a 16-year-old farm boy named Haruo Yoshino reported to the Yokosuka Naval Air Base. He was one of nearly 300 boys entering the Navy's Yokoren Preparatory Aviation Course. From the first day, instructors armed with wooden bats made it clear that toughness was the price of admission. Yoshino and the other trainees learned Morse code, studied navigation, and rowed heavy cutters through the bay until their hands blistered. One lesson in the swimming pool was unforgettable. A non-swimmer was tied with a rope and pushed off the diving board. He floundered and sank. The instructor pulled him up, let him gasp for air, then shoved him in again. They repeated this until the boy could paddle to the edge. That was how the Navy taught men to swim. The training was relentless, but Yoshino knew it was the only path to the cockpit. By the autumn of 1941, the Japanese carrier force was deep in secret preparations for the strike on Pearl Harbor. Yoshino, now a petty officer and observer in a Nakajima Kate torpedo bomber, flew endless practice runs over Kagoshima Bay. His plane dropped specially modified torpedoes fitted with wooden breakaway fins designed to keep them from diving too deep in shallow water. The runs came in at 100 feet lower than anything they had done before. Far above them, Zero fighters under men like Petty Officer First Class Kaname Harada drilled combat air patrol, practicing the tactics that would keep the bombers safe. As the weeks passed, Yoshino carried a small omamori charm from his family inside his flight jacket. It was a simple cloth amulet, a token of hope against the war that everyone knew was coming. December 7th, 1941. The Japanese strike force launched its first wave at dawn. Petty Officer First Class Kaname Harada lifted off from the carrier Soryu and climbed to his assigned altitude. His mission was combat air patrol over the task force, scanning the horizon for American aircraft that might threaten the carriers. The sky remained empty. No enemy planes appeared. After circling for hours without firing a single shot, Harada returned to Soryu, his ammunition unused. Harada's first taste of combat would come later in the skies over Ceylon in the Indian Ocean. But on this day, he was a witness to history, not an actor in it. He landed back on the carrier, frustrated but obedient, knowing the real fight still lay ahead. At the same moment, Petty Officer Second Class Haruo Yoshino gripped the torpedo release handle in his Nakajima Kate. His pilot, Ichiji Nakagawa, lined up on Battleship Row. The modified torpedoes, fitted with wooden breakaway fins, splashed into the shallow water and ran true. Yoshino felt the aircraft lurch upward as the half-ton weapon dropped away. Tracers lashed up from the American gunners. A round punched through the fuselage and struck the radio man, Airman First Class Mitsuo Kawasaki, in the leg. Yoshino shouted into the speaking tube and ordered a sharp bank to starboard. The engine coughed but kept running. They escaped the curtain of fire and headed for the rendezvous point north of Oahu. When they touched down on Kaga's deck, the ground crew counted 8 separate bullet holes in the airframe. Kawasaki was lifted out, his face pale, but his wound not life-threatening. He would be hospitalized and later discharged from the Navy. The pilots gathered in the ready room and learned that 5 of their torpedo bombers had failed to return. 15 men they had eaten breakfast with were gone. But the attack had crippled the American battleship force. The scent of victory hung heavy over the wardroom. Japan had destroyed or damaged 8 battleships and hundreds of aircraft. Yet the empty carrier berths at Pearl Harbor nagged at men like Yoshino. They knew the American flat tops were still at sea. The senior officers insisted the mission was complete, and the task force turned for home. On January 20th, 1942, the carriers struck again. This time the target was Rabaul, the Australian garrison on New Britain. Yoshino flew in the first buntai, his Kate carrying an 800-kilogram bomb. As the formation leveled off over the target, Australian anti-aircraft gunners found their range. The sky around Yoshino's plane filled with black puffs of smoke. Shrapnel slammed into the engine cowling. A jagged piece lodged in the cylinders, and the engine began to vibrate badly. Yoshino called for the pilot to break formation and head straight back to the carrier. When they landed, the ground crew found dozens of small holes in the right wing and a large piece of shrapnel deep in the engine block. The fuel tanks had been missed, his crew was unhurt. The carrier force did not rest after Rabaul. In April 1942, the Kido Butai swept into the Indian Ocean to strike the British Eastern Fleet. Petty Officer First Class Kaname Harada flew combat air patrol over Colombo, watching the Zeros and Kates tear apart the harbor defenses. On April 9th, his flight caught the carrier HMS Hermes and her escort, the destroyer HMAS Vampire, without air cover. The bombers sank both vessels. Harada saw no enemy fighters rise to challenge them. The Indian Ocean was now a Japanese lake, but Yoshino missed this campaign entirely. Kaga had struck a reef in February and spent weeks in dry dock at Sasebo. He rejoined the carrier in late May, just in time for the next operation. The target was a tiny atoll called Midway. It is just before noon on June 4, 1942. Yoshino is in the ready room of the carrier Kaga, having returned from his dawn reconnaissance flight minutes earlier. The ship's loudspeaker blares the bugle call for enemy air attack. He runs to the gun deck and sees a dauntless dive bomber hanging overhead, flipping upside down as it plunges toward the flight deck. The first bomb hits amidships, penetrating into the hangar deck where armed planes sit fueled and ready. The explosions rupture fuel lines and set the ship ablaze. Yoshino climbs down to the lower deck, joins another navigator, and together they jump into the sea. They swim to a large piece of wooden deck planking and cling to it as the destroyer Hagikaze pulls alongside and drops nets. Exhausted, Yoshino climbs aboard, peels off his wet flight suit, and discovers his Omamori charm stuck to his chest. It had slipped from his pocket in the water but did not float away. He takes it as a sign that he is meant to survive. Meanwhile, on the carrier Soryu, Kaname Harada is flying combat air patrol as the dive bombers strike. His Zero runs low on fuel after hours of defensive maneuvering, and he realizes he cannot make it back to his burning ship. He ditches his fighter into the sea near a destroyer, escaping the cockpit just before the plane sinks. A rescue crew pulls him from the water, and he is transferred to a screening vessel, his fighting days for this battle over. The battle ends on June 7th with catastrophic losses. Japan has lost 4 carriers, over 300 aircraft, and 3,500 men, including many of its most experienced pilots. The survivors, Yoshino and Harada among them, are returned to Japan in secrecy and quarantined at Kanoya Air Base, forbidden to speak of the defeat. The Navy hides the disaster from the public, but for the aviators who lived through it, the myth of Japanese invincibility lies shattered on the ocean floor. The survivors of Midway did not stay quarantined for long. By October 1942, the Navy was desperate for experienced crews. Petty Officer Haruo Yoshino was pulled from Kanoya and assigned to the rebuilt carrier Shokaku. He flew reconnaissance missions under Lieutenant Iwai, searching for the American fleet north of the Santa Cruz Islands. On the morning of October 26th, Yoshino completed his search pattern and turned for home. As he neared Shokaku, the landing lights suddenly went dark. The carrier heeled into a hard turn. Dauntless dive bombers were already falling through the clouds. A bomb struck the flight deck, sending a tower of smoke and flame into the sky. Yoshino circled helplessly, watching the damage control teams fight the blaze on the deck. He could not land. Shokaku was crippled. Yoshino diverted to Zuikaku and joined the stack of circling planes. The battle was a tactical victory for Japan. The carrier Hornet was sunk, but the cost was devastating. The wave of veteran pilots lost that day could not be replaced. The replacements arriving the following month could barely land on a flight deck. The grinding war of attrition over Guadalcanal consumed men at a brutal rate. Petty Officer First Class Isamu Miyazaki flew escort for the bombers trying to knock out Henderson Field. On the afternoon of November 13th, his Zero was caught in a crossfire of machine gun fire as he swept over the beachhead. A heavy round punched through the engine cowling. The oil temperature needle spiked into the red. Smoke trailed from the cowl flaps. Miyazaki could feel the controls go heavy. He was losing altitude fast. There was no way to make it back to Rabaul. He pointed the nose toward the open sea and glided down toward the water. The plane hit the surface and immediately began to sink. He unlocked his harness and kicked himself out of the cockpit. The cold salt water shocked his skin. He inflated his life vest and floated as the Zero vanished beneath the waves. Hours passed. The sun sank lower. Despair began to set in. Then, just before dusk, a Japanese destroyer spotted him. He was pulled aboard, wrapped in a blanket, and given a place to sleep. He would recover. By early 1943, the campaign had worn down the Imperial Navy's finest. Petty Officer Kaname Harada flew combat air patrols daily from Rabaul. He watched the ready room grow emptier with each passing week. Planes and pilots were disappearing faster than Japan could replace them. The exhaustion was bone deep, yet the Americans kept coming, strong and fresh. In December, Tokyo admitted the island could not be held. The operation to evacuate the garrison began quietly. Harada flew cover over the withdrawal. The last troops slipped off the beach on February 1st, 1943. The 6-month struggle was over. The aviators who survived knew the meaning. Japan had lost its first major ground campaign. The aircraft carrier arm had been bled white. The invincible spirit of the early war was gone. The tide of the war had turned decisively in the Pacific, and every pilot in the sky understood they were now fighting a battle they could not win. In July 1944, Petty Officer First Class Tomokazu Kasai climbed into his Zero for a raid against American B-24s over Yap Island. He was part of a 4-plane formation led by Warrant Officer Shoichi Sugita, with his friends Tetsu Matsuo and Takaji Tomita flying beside him. They climbed above the bomber formation and dove straight down from the sun, attacking the blind spot on top of the Liberators. It was a tactic they had perfected through painful trial and error. Kasai pulled up after his first pass and saw Tomita's Zero explode in midair. He jammed the throttle forward, clawing for altitude, and looked down through his canopy to see Matsuo's plane trailing smoke and flame toward the ocean. Both friends were gone within seconds. When he returned to Yap that evening, Kasai gathered their personal effects from the empty bunks and wept. The war was consuming everything he loved. On October 25, 1944, the first organized kamikaze mission struck the American fleet off Leyte Gulf. That same week, Chief Petty Officer Toshimitsu Imaizumi stood on an airstrip in the Philippines and met an old friend from his training days, Petty Officer Second Class Toshi Fujimoto. Fujimoto told him he had been assigned to a Toko mission the next morning, part of a unit called Hatsuzakura Tai. Imaizumi could not speak. He simply nodded and agreed to share a bottle of rice wine with his friend that night. The two men sat on the airstrip until dawn, talking about their families and their time together at Tsuchiura. The next morning, the weather grounded the mission, and for a brief moment, Imaizumi dared to hope. But within days, Fujimoto took off and never returned. Not long after, Warrant Officer Tomokazu Ema, the veteran pilot who had taught Imaizumi how to survive in combat, was killed in a dogfight with Hellcats over the Philippines. The 254th Air Group was effectively destroyed. On January 9, 1945, American forces landed at Lingayen Gulf, threatening to trap the surviving Japanese aviators on Luzon. Imaizumi joined a ragged column of pilots and soldiers marching north toward Tuguegarao Airfield. They moved at night to avoid American planes, scavenging food from villages and sleeping in the jungle. The trek lasted weeks, with stragglers picked off by guerrillas and dysentery weakening the men. When they finally reached Tuguegarao, a pair of Betty bombers arrived from Formosa to evacuate them. Imaizumi squeezed into the crowded fuselage as the engines roared and the plane bounced down the grassy strip. Small arms fire crackled from the jungle as they lifted off. Below, the men left behind had no hope of escape. The plane landed at Taichu Airfield on Formosa, where the surviving fighter pilots were reorganized into a new kamikaze unit called Taiji Tai. On March 19, 1945, Kasai was stationed at Kanoya Air Base in Kyushu, flying the new Kawanishi Shidenkai fighter, but on this day he was grounded, laid low by a sudden bout of dysentery. That morning, a massive American carrier raid struck the Kure Naval Shipyard, and the 343rd Air Group scrambled to intercept. Kasai could do nothing but watch from the airfield as the contrails and black smoke of the fight painted the sky. Several of his squadron mates did not return that day, including his friend Yasuharu Nikko, who had trained alongside him since Tsuchiura. A month earlier, a local woman named Kotoko Imai, whom the pilots called Koto-chan, had given each man in Kasai's squadron a purple silk scarf as a good luck charm. She had cut up her wedding kimono to make them. Kasai tied his scarf around his neck before every mission. Many of the men who wore those scarves would never come home, but the gesture of kindness from a stranger gave them a small comfort in a desperate time. On April 15, 1945, Kasai was sitting in his Shidenkai at Kanoya, waiting for orders. Warrant Officer Shoichi Sugita was ahead of him on the flight line, revving his engine for takeoff. Suddenly, a flight of Hellcats rolled in low over the field, strafing the runway. Shells ripped into Sugita Zero, and the plane burst into flames before it could leave the ground. Kasai was about to advance his throttle when his ground crewman ran off, leaving the wheel chocks in place. He was trapped on the ground, unable to move. He scrambled from the cockpit and sprinted for the nearest shelter as bullets kicked up dirt around him. After the attack, he walked to the wreckage of Sugita's plane and found the body still wearing the purple silk scarf. He cremated his friend with the scarf tied around his neck. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender. Many aviators refused to believe what they heard. Imaizumi joined a group of pilots who planned to launch a rogue kamikaze mission the next morning, but maintenance men had removed the propellers from the Zeros overnight on orders from their commander, Lieutenant Commander Tamai. Toshi Fujimoto never returned from his Hatsuzakura-tai mission, his name among the many who gave their lives in the Philippines. Mitsuo Kawasaki, the wounded radio man who had been struck in the leg over Pearl Harbor, recovered fully and was discharged from the Navy, returning to civilian life. The war was over. Kasai returned to his family in Hyogo. Imaizumi returned home. Harada became a peace activist. Yoshino worked for the Tokyo Denryoku Electric Company until his retirement in 1977, and Miyazaki settled quietly in Kyushu. Their stories serve as a reminder that war is not a game of flags and anthems, but a brutal test of human endurance. It is a lesson that each generation must learn anew. If you have your own stories or family memories from this era, we would be honored to hear them in the comments. Please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like to support our work. Thank you for listening.